In 2009, an urban school district in Arizona needed a program to reach their English language learners. The Deer Valley Unified School District turned to Scientific Learning's family of products for their elementary ELL students. Students in grades kindergarten through 6th were placed on the Fast Forward reading and language products. The results were remarkable. 79% of the Deer Valley District's English language learners improved one or more proficiency levels on the AZELA, the Arizona English Language Learner Assessment. What makes the results even greater is where these ELL students made strides. 22% of students once classified basic level reached the proficient category. And 68% of the district's intermediate level students reached proficient. That's nearly double the state average of 38%. But this is just the beginning of what scientific learning can do for your students. Nearly 10 million students in the United States are designated as ELL, or English language learners. For them, school can be a scary and often frustrating place. But with the help of Scientific Learning's revolutionary computer-based products, these children are getting the help they need to become proficient readers.
I've seen students just really enjoy reading and take off with their learning, have a desire to come to school where they once would cry when they came to school because of fear of being in the classroom. Now their parents let me know that they are excited to come to school. They're feeling success in the classroom.
Scientific Learning's Fast Forward and Reading Assistant products are research-proven and evidence-based interventions that can help struggling learners reach their potential and beyond. With Fast Forward and Reading Assistant, it's easy for educators to customize learning for each student's needs. Based on more than 30 years of neuroscience research proving the brain can improve throughout life with individualized adaptive exercise, the Fast Forward program builds brain fitness and accelerates learning. Engaging characters and high-energy animations make learning fun and interactive and help learners feel more comfortable with their new language.
I feel better. I feel like smarter than I was before. Fast Forward helped me a lot.
And with Scientific Learning's exclusive progress tracker, teachers can monitor how each child is improving and where they might need extra help. Schools and districts can also keep track of how their students measure up on statewide testing.
I think Fast Forward is a wonderful program. I think any district that has it will show through their test scores, through increased attendance, through increased appreciation of the school by parents. It's a wonderful program.
Fast Forward accelerates learning by building memory, attention, processing, and sequencing in the areas of English language and reading. As a result, English language learners can see gains of 1 to 2 years in as little as 8 to 12 weeks and maintain an accelerated rate of learning even after the programs end.
What we've seen is that a greater number of students are able to exit the ELL program at a much quicker pace, having participated in Fast Forward, where we used to see multiple years of participation in an ELL program. We see fewer years now for that to take place.
Scientific Learning's Reading Assistant software combines advanced speech verification technology with the latest reading science to help K-12 students strengthen their fluency, comprehension, and vocabulary. Reading Assistant provides intensive reading practice and acts as a tutor so that as students read aloud, the program listens, providing one-on-one guided oral reading support.
I just completely fell in love with that product. I just think that it is just incredible that the kids read to themselves through the mic, and the product like corrects them, and it becomes their teacher, and then they go back and they read it again, and it plugs in little questions that they need to answer.
Big.
Scientific Learning's products significantly speed up the process of learning and comprehending both spoken and written English. These results-oriented products also build fluency, vocabulary, syntax, grammar, and other core content knowledge so students can be successful in any academic setting.
I want something that gives hope back to these children, that they can take power back into themselves and say, education is a part of me and I can do what others are doing. So I love Fast Forward.
With Scientific Learning's Fast Forward and Reading Assistant software products, educators now have the right tools to set any child on the path to successful learning.
Everyone, and welcome to this year's Visionary Conference. We're very glad you're able to join us, and we have lots of great information to share. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Marty Burns, who I've had the pleasure and been honored to work with over the past year. Dr. Burns is a neuroscientist and a leading expert on how children learn. For over 15 years, she has served as adjunct associate professor at Northwestern University and is the author of over 100 journal articles and multiple books. So I would like to introduce Dr. Marty Burns.
Thank you, Heather, and I'm hoping everyone can hear me all right. This is the kind of update on neuroscience that I usually give at the Visionary Conference. It's usually done before the conference as a training workshop, which is a half day, and it's going to be telescoped or microscoped really into an hour and 15 minutes. It's all the same information, but I will be going through it pretty quickly. So I'm sure Carrie will enable you. You can go into the recording if you want to hear more. Think of this as a survey course. It's just an overview with information that you can get on your own to go further into each of these areas, and I'll show you how to do that. As you all know, and as the introduction said, I am an employee of Scientific Learning, but otherwise I don't have financial or non-financial interest in any of the other programs I'll be talking about. We're going to talk about the new research in neuroscience. A large clump of it is connectomes. We're going to talk about treatment plans and how the new connectome research applies to what we do as therapists. And then we're going to talk about methodology for rehabilitation of language, cognition, and motor function. The overall agenda, and it looks like the research on neuromodulators is the longest section, but actually it's going to be very short. It's just going to be like 5 minutes. But the biggest part of the this session will be neurophysiology research on connectomes and their relevance to language, attention, memory, and executive functions. And then after about an hour and 15 minutes, I'll open it up for questions. There are dozens of references for you here. They're all at the very beginning, and references on all sorts of different aspects of what I'm talking about. References also are listed on each of the slides where that would be appropriate. So when you see a reference, if you want to go into it further and understand it better, know that you can get that always at Google Scholar. Anything that's on here, with the exception of a book, and even books will be listed on Google Scholar, but are available on Google Scholar. And that is not a Google search, it's a Google Scholar search. So you would type Scholar in the Google window, then type in the author's name, the last name, no initials, and then a few keywords from the article that you want, and then you can download that. So let's just start from the beginning in neuroscience, just to make sure everyone's on the same page, and then we'll get into the new research on connectomes. So, of course, we all know that our understanding of how the brain is organized really started with two lines of research and two interests. One was mapping out the cortex, and one of the early maps was done by Brodmann, who was so accurate in his anatomical description of the way different cell structure exists in the human cortex that we still use his maps today. And you probably know, if you're a speech-language pathologist, for example, that Broca's area is often considered to be area 44, 45, and 47. Wernicke's area is often considered to be area 22. So those Brodmann's areas have been used for a long time. Now, when you have something like Brodmann's areas, what that does is generate research to figure out what each area does. And so for many years, 75 years, there was a lot of work done to try to figure out what these regions were doing. And actually, there are researchers you'll see that are still doing that. But what happened after the Second World War was that research that had been done by Carl Wernicke and published by Wernicke and Broca, which had kind of gone under the undercover for several years, started to resurface in an understanding of connectionistic theory. And the person who really introduced that concept in this country was Norman Geschwin. And that evolved in connectionistic theory, said, well, these regions of the brain just don't operate by themselves, these Brodmann's areas, but actually they have to be connected to each other. And that evolved into something we call network theory that was advanced by people like Marcel Mechelen, who I work with here at Northwestern University, or I should say he is here at Northwestern University, and other neurologists who are trying to understand how the brain integrates and processes information. So network theory became kind of the way that we understood how the brain did its job. And you can see that one of the early slides, and everyone who ever sees a talk of mine sees one of these, was done by Joy Hirsch at Columbia University when fMRI was first getting a foothold into the neuroscience realm, especially behavioral neuroscience. And what Joy Hirsch did is for the first time actually looked at typical adults like you and me and looked at what parts of our brain were lighting up simultaneously when we were doing different kinds of tasks, very structured tasks, and you all know this, and you know that this is the object naming network, and you all know, I'm sure, the Hebbian axion that underlies this, that these regions, when you see them light up like this on an fMRI scanner, these are regions of activity that are measured by blood oxygenation. So where the blood has been deoxygenated, really, after you use a part of the brain, but it's a very short window. It's a 20 millisecond window. So we often say these neurons that light up together, these neurons that are operating together like that have to be wired together. And the axon, that is the axiom. Neurons that fire together, wire together. That fMRI research started to pervade the whole behavioral neuroscience world. And so we have a slide like this of Hickok and Papels that came out by the mid-2000s. That 2005, 2006, starting to really differentiate this language network for us in terms of different aspects of processing. So we have the blue areas are the articulatory network, the parts of our brain that we use to produce speech, really, and to organize sounds into words and to use morphemes. The purple areas are the regions where we understand semantics and attribute meaning to words. And then we have this Wernicke's area, this little green area, and then the yellow area, the orange area is really, the phonological network is really Wernicke's area. And those work together to enable us to perceive speech sounds. So this was where the network theory had progressed to by the mid-2000s. What happened at about that same time is a new technology became available that Dr. Chalal talked about a couple of years ago at the Visionary, called diffusion tensor imaging. And what diffusion tensor imaging allows us to do is view the underlying fiber tracts that do connect these regions together. So we no longer have to assume when we look at an fMRI and we see areas lit up, we don't have to assume that those areas are connected by a fiber tract. We can actually see actual fiber tracts that link different regions of the brain. And so with that kind of research, by 2008, we have someone like Lebel, who published this paper, showing each of these fiber tracts in a more differentiated way based on DTI, and then also the developmental pattern of these fiber tracts. And what this led us to understand by 2008 was that the brain is still maturing, very actively maturing, all the way through high school and into our early 20s, and that we can see this maturation in terms of the myelination of the fiber tracts that link the regions of the area together. At the same time, that research was going on in behavioral neurology, looking at the fiber tracts. We have something called systems neurology that was looking at the maps, going back into Brodmann's areas again, but this time actually using electrodes that are going to be record actual neuronal activity in specific regions like Broca's area, like Brodmann's area 44, to kind of figure out how do these cortical neurons become mapped for different functions. So that research was going on at the same time, and you can see here one of the first studies was published in 2009 where you had this very detailed description of Broca's area, and it was by Sahin and colleagues. They have 3 adults that were undergoing neurosurgery, and they determined with fMRI, you can see that in the B and C portions of this slide here up on the left-hand side where my arrow is, you can see that they determined where Broca's area was in these specific brains, and then they went in and placed needle electrodes that you can see here, depth probes they're called. You can see an F right into that region that they had determined was Broca's area in these individuals. And they recorded, as you can see over in I and J, exactly what those neurons were interested in when speech stimuli were presented on a screen and the individuals were asked to think about either a grammatical ending of a word or think about the lexical retrieval of a word. And what they found is Broca's area is very precisely organized even in just the layers of it. So you can see that down here in J, the different colors, the different layers to process different aspects of phonological information. And that means that Broca's area has to become mapped to sequence sounds into words and to sequence morphemes, word endings, prefixes, and suffixes in the appropriate place. Now, about the same time that Sahin was doing that research, Chang the next year did the same research using a little electrode plate on Wernicke's area, this area down here, area 22, that we know is very important for processing of phonological information. But in this case, it's discriminating speech sounds, and you can see the sounds he looked at up in B above were ba, da, and ga. And what he found is, as many of you know, if you've been listening to this kind of update for the last few years, what Chang et al. Found was that we have little tiny groupings of cells in the cortex of this area of the brain, the superior temporal gyrus and the superior temporal sulcus, that are mapped specifically for what we call categorical perception, which you know is essentially what Fast Forward, much of Fast Forward is language and literacy are all about, distinguishing ba from da and da from ga and ba from ga. And so we could actually see the cortical organization of the brain designed that way. Now, you can imagine that with all that research going on, what I updated last year was that researchers started using all these technologies combined. And one of the first set of researchers that used multiple technologies from a clinical standpoint, what we're all interested in, was Turkin and Dronkers. And some of you know Nina Dronkers because she's at the VA hospital in San Francisco and did one of the early studies of Fast Forward with aphasic patients. And she's a neurolinguist who's been interested in aphasia her whole career. So in 2011, she used combined technologies. I presented this last year at Visionary, and she looked at Broca's aphasic, so the region of interest was Broca's area, these little blue dots in area 44 of the frontal lobe, and what she saw was this long, huge fiber tract on DTI that was implicated if somebody had problems with motor speech. We often refer to that, if you're a speech pathologist, as apraxia of speech. If they had problems with verbal fluency, so this would be a non-fluent aphasic, or if they had problems with grammatical processing. And we know that that's what Broca's area, of course, does, this little blue dot. But then we could see which pathway was the pathway that's primarily involved with that. And that's very helpful to understand because it means if I'm working with adults or children who have this pathway compromised, even though Broca's area might be fine, those individuals will have problems learning grammar, they're going to have non-fluent speech, and they're going to have problems with motor speech production. At the same time, she did the same thing with Wernicke's aphasics. Those are fluent aphasics who have trouble with comprehension and speech sound perception. And she was able to map out the pathways using DTI that would be associated with that ability to process speech and perceive speech. And as you can see, those are a much more complicated set of fiber tracks. There are actually 4 fiber tracks involved. Much more of the left hemisphere is devoted to auditory perception than is devoted to this processing of speech, which is interesting, but it supports the value of the kinds of interventions that we do with Fast4Word products, because those are designed to get at these multiple fiber tracks, as you well know. So that catches us up now. It took me about 12 or 14 minutes to get us caught up so you know where we're going now. And what I'm going to do is update you on really 2 major lines of research that have gone beyond this. There's another line of research I'm not going to cover today. I'm not going to cover new research on electrophysiological patterns. I'm not going to gamma and delta and different firing patterns, but I am going to do a blog on that to update all of you on some great new research that was done looking at gamma oscillations and the benefits of fast-forward and auditory processing. But that's another topic, so I'm going to do a blog on that in a few weeks. But for now, I'm going to update you on the new research on mapping of the cortex, and I'm going to update you on connectomes. And then at the very end, I'm just going to give you some guidelines of where to go to update yourself on neurochemistry as well. So the first thing we're going to look at is the new studies of mapping. And remember, it was Chang and Sahin that looked at mapping of Wernicke's area and mapping of Broca's area, specifically for phonological aspects of speech. This exciting new research was published in December of 2012, just about 5 months ago, by Huth et al. They're at the Gallant Labs, and what they have mapped out on the human brain is the entire semantic map of the brain. So how words and word meanings are hierarchically organized on the cortex. It's quite exciting. This is their website, so all of you can go to their website, gallantlab.org/semanticmovies/. If you type that in, you'll get a talk by Huth, and you'll be able to go to their website and actually view these maps of the cortex. And what they did, as most neuroscientists now are doing, is they combined different technologies. In this case, they used fMRI studies, but they also were using other kinds of statistical models. And what they were able to do, you can see in this slide, it's very complicated. You can't really see it too well here, but if you go to that website, you can actually move around on the website and look at this. But you can see that these different colors here, yellow and blue and red and purple, correspond to different hierarchies of words, like people and buildings. And then in each hierarchy area, like let's say the yellow area or the green area, you have sub-hierarchies. So you have specific words that would be associated with people, or specific words that might be associated with movement, or specific words that would be associated with buildings or tools. And you can see how they're organized and how the kind of hierarchical web that's formed. This is actually the human cortex over here on the left that has been flattened out. And you see there were 4 subjects that participated in the study. Over here you can see the hierarchical categories of the words and word meanings. So mobile versus immobile, whether it's animal or not, whether it can move, animacy, human versus non-human, social versus non-social, biological versus non-biological, place versus non-place in real world size. And you can see that in each of these individuals there's quite a bit of variability, but our brain organizes a huge semantic space where all of the words and their meanings have specific localization. Now, what that means for us as therapists is really exciting as clinicians, because it means that With this new research, what we're going to be able to do is figure out how to work with children and adults hierarchically. So we'll be able to actually look at semantic organization. And I have an aphasic patient I'm working with right now. I'm going to see him tomorrow morning. Very sad, young 42-year-old gentleman, businessman, who had a massive left hemisphere stroke. And essentially what he's having trouble with is comprehending words and producing words, which, of course, is what often happens with aphasia. And what I now know is how to work with categorical hierarchies with him as opposed to working with specific words. And so I can get a better impact much faster. But now the other side of this is we also, and this is where Fast Forward comes in, we also can utilize some of this research to be more economical in our therapy, meaning we can figure out what is the fastest way to build or to get the brain to reorganize itself after an injury or to organize itself in development. What is the most efficient and effective way, as opposed to just looking at problems and then trying to fix specific problems? And I'll take that further with you in just a couple of minutes. So the takeaway from the new research that we have up till now is that most neurological disorders are probably best understood by a combination of these connection maps. We used to call them networks. Now that we're going to call them connectomes, because we can actually see the fiber tracks underneath, the wiring patterns of the brain, and I'm going to go into that further with you in a minute. But we also have this great modular research that's coming out so that we can see how the cortical cells are organized and what jobs they do. That will allow us to differentially diagnose problems differently. So you probably all know, those of you who are clinicians, psychologists, and speech pathologists, that the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the Psychiatric Association, just came out, the revised one. And the big complaint that's going on and the big discussion going on is it really is still symptom-based. Here we have all this great neuroscience that helps us to understand these underlying problems associated with things like schizophrenia, and you'll see that in a few minutes, or attention deficit disorder, or autism spectrum disorder, and yet the DSM-5 is still looking at the surface. They're still having you come in and describe what's wrong. And the next iteration will include all of this neuroscience research. It's just the problem is, if you get into the discussion on this, and there's a great article in New York Times May 7th, just a couple weeks ago on this whole topic, we can't do connectomes quite yet. The neuroscience wasn't there soon enough. But the next DSM, the DSM-6, will probably be much more neuroscience-based. And that will allow all of us who are kind of ahead of the curve, which is you guys, that's why this is a visionary conference, who've always been ahead of the curve, to develop treatment hierarchies based on this information, which is why I'm updating you today. So to kind of get into that now, I'm going to talk about a few areas where this kind of research is being used clinically. One is understanding default mode. Now, I've been talking about default mode for a few years, but I'm just going to, it's a visionary, but I'm just going to summarize it for you briefly. It's a real nice summary article that was published in Trends in Neuroscience, if you're interested in that. But essentially, a default mode is if you're looking at an fMRI, and this is fMRI research here essentially, and remember, when you're looking at an fMRI, what you're doing is looking at a bold signal. This is my arrow here. When you're doing a task in an fMRI, like thinking of a word, what you do is you have these specific network regions that light up. And you know that from Hirsch's research, and that's why I kind of summarized that again at the beginning. Default mode is what happens when you stop doing that task. So I'm thinking of a word that has to do with the white things that fall down from the sky in the winter. That word is snow. Second I think of that word, my language naming network lights up. But then I have a little rest period, and when I have the rest period, my mind can wander. And I can kind of be guessing at what word might come next, or I can be trying to figure out what I'm going to have for lunch, or maybe I can be figuring out just thinking to myself how boring it is to lie in this fMRI scanner. But whatever's going on, my mind is wandering, and that's called default mode. And what you can see is that default mode is not a rest mode. The brain is very active. The frontal lobe is very active when you're not doing a specific task. so is an area we call the temporal parietal junction. And so researchers have been interested in this default mode for a while because it turns out it's correlated with some disorders, like, for example, Alzheimer's disease. The default mode is the area where the neurofibrillary tangles and the amyloid beta deposits tend to accumulate or aggregate in schizophrenia, in Alzheimer's disease. So people started wondering, well, how important is this default mode? And it's often referred to, and that's what this slide refers to, it comes from that article I told you about that's kind of a summary article, as the mind-wandering network. And so some speculation is that perhaps these aggregates of protein accumulate in something like Alzheimer's disease because their mind is wandering more, and so their brain can't clean it out, which means that if that's true, if that theory is true, then structured stimulation like Fast for Word, for example, or Reading Assistant would be great to keep the brain actively stimulated. And you all know that's been Michael Merznick's kind of view for many, many years, and that's what underlies his programs like Posit Science and Brain HQ. But what's really interesting from our standpoint as clinicians who work with individuals with problems is there's now new research. You can see this was published by Bunnell in 2011, showing that if you have individuals who've had head injuries, and these are head-injured patients, TBI patients, you can see at the bottom in orange, TBI patients under C, you can distinguish which ones are going to have severe problems with selective attention from those who won't, just based on looking at this default mode. So it turns out the default mode might be a measure, it's a measure of mind wandering, but it also might have clinical value for us to do things like diagnose ADHD, or if we're working with individuals who have head injuries, to differentiate those that really need to have work with a selective attention. And you probably all know from the research I reviewed a few years ago that Courtney Stevens did a great article with Fast Forward showing that one of the things Fast Forward really improves is selective attention, Fast Forward language. So that takes us to Connectome. So we've got this research now that's helping us to kind of look at these other kinds of networks of the brain and all of these fiber tracks. And so researchers have gotten to the point within the last few years, neuroscientists, of saying, well, let's really try to integrate all of this. Let's really try to integrate the entire brain and understand the wiring pattern of the brain and how it can break down and how we can stimulate it to keep it from breaking down. And any of you who really want to study this further, a nice summary of the Connectome project was published in the January-February issue of Discover magazine, so all of you can get that online very easily, and it just is a summary of this Connectome project, the new project maps of the wiring of the brain. And you probably know Obama came out with an initiative just last month going even further, putting more money into this research. So this research should go fairly quickly, and the nice thing about it is it's clinical research. It is not theoretical research, so it is designed to be used to help diagnose problems and to be able to treat them. So this is just a diagram of the human connectome, if you will. This is the wiring of our brain. You can see how unbelievably complex it is, and how pervasive these fiber tracks are. They aren't these nice, simple little highways, but very complex wiring patterns. But they're going to, as we can tease them out, or as neuroscientists can, they're going to be able to understand some underlying problems associated with processing disorders, which is where I'm going to take you now. So to kind of understand this, what they're looking at is, especially for things like schizophrenia, and in our case what's interesting to us is autism, is what is an efficient brain wiring map and what is an inefficient brain wiring map. If you think about autism, the characteristic of autism is the brain is very inefficient. It is not processing efficiently. You don't say a word, the child hears the word, they perceive the word, and then they respond. autism, there's an overflow of activity that is not very productive. And so to understand that and to understand this Connectome project, this is a nice article by Bull Mohrens. You can all download it at Google Scholar if you're interested. And it just shows that if you had the most efficient brain versus the least efficient brain, what you would have is a brain where you don't go from point A to point B to point B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L to get to the frontal lobe from the temporal lobe, but rather you would have a direct route, right? And if you had a lot of direct routes, the brain could get mislaid. You could get distracted very easily. So what we need is a balance between a brain that is a high-cost brain, where you're using a lot of energy to process information, and a low-cost brain to a highly efficient brain versus a lowly efficient brain. And so what we're doing is looking for connectomes and how they organize so that you and I we can process information quickly and efficiently. And so when researchers like Bull Mohrens in their summary article try to provide this information, they do it in terms of these networks that we've always understood, these connectomes, but in this case, what is the wiring pattern for one kind of processing, like in the blue area here that you see organized versus the red area or the green area? And they're specifically looking at the big circles or the big squares in different colors that would be hubs, kind of centers of activity, versus the kind of tangents. And you can think of this the way you might think of airlines and their hubs. If airlines learned that the most efficient way for them to operate was not to have an airplane that flies from Duluth, Minnesota to Cincinnati, Ohio, and from Duluth, Minnesota to Minneapolis, and from Duluth, Minnesota to Ann Arbor, Michigan, and from Duluth, Minnesota to Chicago, but to rather have hubs and make Chicago a hub so all these regions end up in Chicago, and then you can go back to another region through Chicago if you're American Airlines or United, or Dallas could be a hub. If you're Delta, Cincinnati or Atlanta would be a hub. And airlines go in and out of those. Well, it looks like the brain organizes somewhat that way too, so that we have these central areas of processing, and then that enables us to go off on tangents, if you will, and handle different kinds of information. So we have these hubs, and then we have these modules. And what I want you to understand in this, and I know I'm going quickly and it's a lot of information, but the important thing to understand is it's everything we've learned up till now. So all that research we have on modules that was done by Sahin in 2009 and Chang in 2010 and other researchers like Hirsch and all of the others that are trying to figure out this information, what we can now do is combine all of that, and we can understand this as connectomes. And we can put in the fiber tracks as well as the modules and start to figure out how the brain organizes itself. Now, where does this take us clinically? Well, for one thing, it really helps us to understand acquired problems like aphasia better. And you already saw that with Nina Dronker's research. It helps us to understand what connectomes are impaired and then to target our therapy for those specific problems. So, for example, if I have a Broca's aphasia, what I really want to do is target grammar, and I want to target motor speech. If I have a Wernicke's aphasia, I really want to target auditory processing. I don't want to have that person doing a lot of motor speech kinds of exercises. But for those of us who work with developmental problems, and most of you do, we want to understand why those symptoms exist. What is autism? Why does it present itself the way it does? Is it a problem with brain efficiency? Is it a connectome issue, which it looks like it is? It looks like the hubs are not functioning appropriately in some cases, and we'll get into that more in a minute. And then it also helps those of us who don't work with something like autism per se, but to understand ADHD or memory problems and how you can actually access those processing systems as well to improve those systems of the brain without necessarily having to use medication. Or if medication is used, to target the medication more effectively so that you know what medication affects which connectome and how, as opposed to just trial and error. You have ADHD, so I'm going to try you on Ritalin. If Ritalin doesn't work, then I'm going to try a barbiturate of some kind. And if that doesn't work, I'm going to try speed. I mean, all of these kinds of different issues can be resolved so much more carefully. So this is a wonderful article by Using Connectome Research, published just in 2012, the end of 2012, by Irenia et al., with 3 patients who had traumatic brain injuries, looking at connectomes and understanding the effect of treatment. And what you can see here is the 3 patients had MRIs done, 3 different kinds of functional imaging done or just imaging done at the acute stage of their illness, so these 3 are acute, and then several months after their traumatic brain injury. And the researchers where you see the arrows are looking at the areas of damage, but then they're looking in the chronic brain at where the connectomes have been affected long term. And to do this, they did this very careful color mapping of the cortex of all of these patients using something called Free Surfer. So they're really looking at these modules the way Brodmann had to do it, but he had to do it after people died. You can now do it while people are still alive, and they're developing the connectomes. Now, this is how complex these connectomes look, but what you can see is the color coding corresponds to the colors over here on the cortex using this Free Surfer mapping, and we can actually see which connectomes have been impaired by the dark colors and the light colors, and we can see in the chronic brain where atrophy has occurred. Now, why this is so important is it means if you were to work with a head injured patient and you saw that atrophy was likely to occur in certain connectomes, and we know what those connectomes, the kind of information they process, that's what you could target with your therapy in the first few months of working with a patient. So you would know how to target your therapy. You would know the most efficient kind of therapy to do that would prevent the brain from letting certain kinds of fiber tracts time. That then takes us into, well, where does all of this go with Connect or with the default mode, and that takes us to autism and schizophrenia. So there are researchers, as you see here, this is the Bullmore and Sporns article that I talked to you about, and what they have done is they have applied this understanding of connectomes to disorders like schizophrenia and autism. And what they've looked at specifically is default mode processes. And what they have found is that if you compare brain disorders that affect these high-cost component networks, that is, these networks that utilize a lot of metabolic energy that aren't very efficient. So think of a high-cost network as being expensive to you metabolically, but not allowing you to be very efficient in your processing. It is what defines the difference between schizophrenic adults and healthy volunteers. So schizophrenia is a very complex brain that is over-functioning is a way to think about it, but is not efficient in the way that it's functioning. Attentional networks can also be understood that way. So we have a few researchers who have been looking. Remember I said that we know in traumatic brain injury we can predict, at least there's some research showing we can predict that individuals who have traumatic brain injuries that show more default network activation are those that are going to have sustained attention disorders and problems with selective attention. And so what the research has been looking at with attentional networks then is different kinds of attention networks and connectomes associated with different kinds of attentional disorders. So I want to take you there now. This is a wonderful study published by Buchholz and Meyer-Lindberg in 2012. I'm going to try to do the best justice I can to this because it's so important for all of us, but it differentiates some neuropathologies. This is where a lot of the researchers wish the DSM-5 would have gone, but you can see it's new research. It's only been out there for a few months, so you can't expect something like DSM-5 that was in development for 3 years to suddenly be able to capture all of this research, but it is the connectomes that underlie the problems we work with clinically and better enable us, or presumably it's Buchholz and Meyer-Lindberg are theorizing that we're going to have a better understanding of the problems if we understand them through this connectome model. So they differentiate 4 connectomes that underlie problems we see clinically. And the first one is problems we see clinically that involve working memory, goal-directed attention, that's sometimes called cognitive control. So it involves selective and sustained attention, but it means that you're attending to what you want to and you're not letting your mind wander. So all of you are having to listen to me, you're having to look at these slides, and you're trying very hard to stay focused because a lot of information is just being thrown at you all of a sudden, and you're going, holy cow, and so you're trying to maintain your attention, and that's goal-directed attention. And it also is a network involved in monitoring performance. So if I'm trying to do something, maybe play football, it allows me to sustain my attention to the plays. It also lets me evaluate how the play is going and shift and move around if I see that the play isn't going right. If I'm giving this lecture, one of the things I'm doing is checking my clock every 2 or 3 minutes to make sure that I'm on time because I've got to monitor my own lecture for you guys so I know I can get through the information. So not only do I have to have working memory involved to hold all this information in mind I'm trying to tell you, I have to be planning ahead, I have to be very goal-directed in where I'm going and my own attention, and I have to be watching myself to make sure I'm not getting off track. That's this connectome. Now, what would happen if that connectome were impaired? What would you see clinically? You would see children who have problems, they're highly distractible, and they're not attentive. You would see children who have problems with working memory, and you would see children who have problems with executive functions like planning and being organized. I will bet you, for all of you listening to me today, that is probably about 50% of your caseload. And we have great research showing one of the things Fast Forward, language, and literacy really help with is working memory and goal-directed attention. And we have that wonderful research of Connie Stevens that was done at University of Oregon. So we know that we have a program that addresses that, and we know that this is the underlying network, and it involves the anterior cingulate, that's that medial portion, the left prefrontal cortex, often called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the left and right, and the ipsilateral, part of the parietal lobe, the parietal sulcus. Now, we can also look at, and we have researchers, this is some research of Schachter, who's very interested in memory. We can look at different kinds of memory functions this way, too, through connectomes. So he published an article in 2012 looking at the difference between planning ahead autobiographically, that is, thinking about my future, thinking about where I want to be next week and next year and 6 years from now, and anticipating my future life, thinking about my past, that would be my autobiographical planning, has to include past and present, versus thinking ahead visually, spatially. So I have to think ahead visual spatially if I'm driving. I have to do that if I'm trying to play a team sport. And what he did is outline different connectomes associated with visual spatial planning, for example. So we have researchers going about this connectome research in different ways. This is a slide I included because it's a great slide that you can have an interactive test that you can give yourself. It's simply normed on typical adults, so it wouldn't be useful with children and it wouldn't be useful with individuals with impairment, but it shows you what kinds of skills you need to have this selective attention and to ignore distractions. Sometimes it's called, if a child has trouble with that, disinhibition or distractibility. But it's a great test that you can kind of take yourself. You can type this link in and take it yourself. It was at the New York Times. Or we can look at a test like the Stroop test, which enables us to get an idea of what it's like to be able to ignore one kind of stimulus. In this case, if I asked you to name the colors and to ignore the word, you would have to inhibit the word red and just say green. You'd have to inhibit the word yellow and or the word green and just say yellow. You can see I had trouble with that. So those are examples of response inhibition, and that's what that kind of, the way we can look at those kinds of functions. Now, we have another network, the frontoparietal network, this goal attention network that we were talking about, that is the network that allows us to do this inhibition and that allows us to have this selective attention. And we have research published by Chen in 2011 showing that when you improve attention, you improve executive function. Now, this is really exciting for us because what it means is something like fast-forward language or fast-forward literacy that we know is so effective for selective attention may, in fact, be very effective for executive function as well. And we do have some school studies that would suggest that. We just need some random controlled studies to take that a little bit further. Okay, and then we have, this is the Courtney Stevens article that I've been referring to. It's been around for a while. It was published in 2008, but I wanted to draw all of your attention to it. You can all Google Scholar it, but it does show the effectiveness of fast forward with the ability to attend, to ignore distractions, both with children who are language impaired. These were 7-year-old children who are language impaired, and typically developing children. Both typically developing children and language impaired children, after 6 weeks of fast forward language, showed improved ability to ignore distractions through very objective measures using electrophysiological testing compared to typical and language impaired children who had no fast forward intervention at all. Now, another area we know fast forward is very effective for and has been designed to improve is working memory. You know that working memory includes your ability, your phonological memory, your memory to your ability to hold sounds in mind, as well as your visual spatial scratch pad. And we know that we have a lot of research now that shows that you can improve both problem solving and you can improve all sorts of reading comprehension when you exercise working memory. And that research has come out of Suzanne Jagge's lab. She used what's called an NBAC task. I don't have time to describe that yet here, but you all know from her research that when adults did the NBAC task for 19 days in a row, which is a very specific working memory task, they showed significant improvement in something called fluid intelligence. It's a measure of IQ that looks at problem-solving ability. But we have some other research that's come out, research by Jules et al. Published in 2010, and Kondo published in 2005, showing that you get a lot of bang for your buck when you work on memory skills, and then working memory skills. And then this was a wonderful paper published in 2012, again, Suzanne Jagge's lab, looking at children's reading comprehension, showing that when the only difference is if you put all the children in the same activities, the reading literacy activities in a classroom, but you have some of these children doing working memory tasks, the children who do the working memory tasks actually show significant improvements in reading comprehension compared to children who only have reading comprehension exercises. So again, you get a lot of bang for your buck. So that's that working memory selective attention domain, or connectome. Then what I want to explain to you is another domain. This is what's called the frontostriatal cognitive domain, or connectome. This is the connectome that you would need to be flexible. So all of you, when you are using Fast for Word, and we changed from using Fast for Word with CDs to using Fast for Word online, had to become flexible, and you had to switch. All of you that went from our original Fast for Word products, where we had Circus Sequence, had to change when we went to the revised program, where we have SkyGym, for example. And we are all flexible, and flexibility is a measure of frontal lobe function, as is your ability to make decisions based on how important they are, to prioritize your life. That's called value-based decision-making. To stay motivated, to be able to determine what is really important things that you work on. It's called salience attribution, to be able to decide, this is an important thing for me to do, this is an important thing for me to do today, and to be able to benefit from reinforcement. And that cognitive domain is very important for cognitive control. But when we see that domain impaired in our children, in our clinics, we see children who are impulsive or compulsive. We might see people that have a lot of problems with motivation, and they become hedonistic. They become interested in sex or in immediate reinforcement. They can't delay reinforcement. They can't they don't have long-term goals. You see this a lot if you work with aging adults, but you see this a lot if you work with traumatic brain injury and autism spectrum disorders. And it can actually become a problem really of psychosis. But you'll also see a lot of risk-taking behavior, because people are going for immediate gains. They're not going for long-term gains. And the striatum is essentially, those of you who know your neuroscience fairly well, our reinforcement center. It includes the basal ganglia. It's very important for habit learning. But we also have the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And then we have this part of the brain, the orbital frontal cortex, that's so important for value assessments. Is this really important? I call it the, gee, I wish I could have had a V8 part of our brain. That's the orbital frontal cortex. And then the medial prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that's very important in thinking about other people and things that we call theory of mind. We also will tend to have some children who have problems here, especially if we have children who are on the autism spectrum, but you see this more impaired with aging adults and traumatic brain injured adults, where you get this very pervasive frontal lobe dysfunction. If you want to look at flexibility objectively, a test you can use for yourself is this test. Again, it's only normed on adults, but you can type this into your web browser and go to the New York Times and look at how flexible you are. And then I just want to show you what Buchholz and Meyer-Lindberg have described as two additional connectomes that really aren't things we address so much as speech and language pathologists or psychologists who work with learning disabilities. But we do see it again with schizophrenia, and we see it with autism, which is the inability to take someone else's perspective, theory of mind, my inability to think about what you're thinking about, what you want to know, and my ability to understand myself or self-representation. And the symptom domain is insensitivity to social cues. Obviously, we see that a lot with autism spectrum disorder, attachment deficits, and impaired empathy, which you'll see with sociopaths, as the two kids who blew up the Boston Marathon, that were responsible for Boston Marathon bombs. So they weren't thinking at all about the pain of other people, or at least if they were projecting it into some kind of a construct that based on a religious belief that they had. But that connectome then would include the medial prefrontal cortex, again, very important for compassion and caring about other people and theory of mind, and the temporal parietal junctions of the right and left hemisphere, and in this case, the posterior cingulate, the back part of that big C that kind of is a limbic system structure that runs along just from a big C in our brain that runs from the occipital lobe over to the frontal lobe, but very medially within the brain. And then the last connectome that's been identified by Buchholz-Meyer-Lindberg is what they call the threat detection and emotional regulation one, which enables you to determine if you see a threat. It's kind of your fight and flight sense, your ability to respond emotionally. Here they're calling it affective responsiveness, but your ability to be appropriate emotionally, to regulate your emotions so that you don't cry when it's inappropriate or laugh when it's inappropriate, and so and to enable you to extinguish fears when they're not appropriate. And you can imagine, although we don't work with that, most of us who work with Fast Forward, but many psychologists do, these would be individuals who have anxiety disorders, who ruminate constantly about anger or frustration. Again, I'm drawn to the Boston Marathon bomber who died, who seemed to be ruminating over and over again about anger toward Americans for whatever reason, hypervigilance, over-perceiving the world, thinking that people are watching you and paying attention to you all the time, and being very unstable from an emotional standpoint. And this would be, of course, a hierarchy or a description of a paranoid schizophrenic to a great extent. So now that takes us to where is all of this taking us? What can we do with all of this? And the exciting thing about the connectome therapy is that it is helping us to pull all of this information into guidelines that can help us to do better research with Fast Forward, to figure out how to target it, to figure out how effective it is in other domains that we haven't even looked at yet, and to understand its applications clinically. But the last part of this talk, and then we'll be done and I'll take questions, is understanding the chemical neuromodulation of the brain, and understanding the new research on how Fast Forward, which you know has been designed not only just to drive the development of these connectomes that we now see are so important clinically, and we're getting the clinical relevance to them, but also to understand the underlying neurochemistry that's built into our products. So as kind of just a little break, I'm going to take you to a book by Chapman that just came out in 2013. Chapman is a neuroscientist, neuropsychologist really, who wrote a wonderful book. It's in the bibliography on creating a smart brain. There are a couple of those out there now. There's another one by Rudolph Tanzi, who's also an excellent neuropsychologist who's very interested in how to take all this information for typical adults and make our brains function better. But Chapman does work with traumatic brain injured patients, and so the takeaways Chapman has for us from all this neuroscience research is, number one, balanced brain stimulation. That active brain and mental stimulation is required to recover from any kind of loss of cognitive function or any kind of interference with the development of cognitive function. So instead of just being symptom-based, we have to really focus on stimulating the brain. All of you know that, but unfortunately there's a big division, at least in our field of speech and language pathologists, between therapists who feel we should do everything symptom-based versus those who understand the importance of cognitive stimulation. And along those lines, I like to use Mersnick's and Jenkins' 80% rule, that we want to keep stimulation for all of our clients at this maximum level, where too low of a challenge keeps them bored and they don't like it, but if it's too high of a challenge, they become frustrated. And that adaptability of our programs fits right into that, where you can ratchet up all exercises by a notch to keep all of our clients moving at the optimal rate. Bill Jenkins once told me he described that, and it was also described in a couple of articles. The book by Stanislav Dehaene uses the same terminology, zone of proximal development, that well-designed neuroscience programs are designed to be just difficult enough to engage the client or patient, but easy enough to maintain high spirits. Secondly, we do have to focus on strategic attention, that is a huge part of rehabilitation or habilitation of most of the problems that we work with, so that attention should be a goal that we work on, and we do know that the Fast Forward programs are programs that target attentional skills, specifically strategic and goal-oriented attention, and that's very important for development of the frontal lobe. It's very important for cognitive control. It's very important for executive functions. And the therapist can gradually add kinds of distractions into a therapeutic situation to build tolerance. That's Chapman's advice. But as you know, with Fast Forward, those kinds of graduated attentional tasks are built in very strategically. And then, of course, the importance of working with higher order processes, especially working memory. That all of our therapy should include working memory exercises. Again, Fast Forward Language, Fast Forward Literacy, all the reading products, and then when we get into Reading Assistant, are heavily based on demands of working memory. And so we know that working memory demands drive the brain to develop and to mature very effectively and lead to better ability on higher level tasks. And then finally, Chapman summarizes with what all you're doing today, which is to stay informed and keep up with the new research, because as you can tell, it is exploding. For me to get through all of this in an hour, you can't imagine the number of times I rehearsed this so I could get through these slides in that amount of time, because the research is coming from all sorts of different angles. So let's go in now to the very last section of this, the last 15 minutes, and then I'll take questions, which is this whole idea of neuromodulators. Now, to remind you, you know that there are neurochemicals, neurotransmitters that are released at the synapse. You can see that in this slide. And they're either excitatory or inhibitory chemicals that either enable the receiving neuron to fire, they actually promote firing, or they quiet that neuron down. If it's an inhibitory chemical, it's going to quiet the receiving neuron down. So the dendrite that's picking up that chemical is going to quiet down. If it's an excitatory chemical, that neuron's going to fire. And you may know that Michael Merznick, for a long time, had talked about autism spectrum disorders as being an imbalance of excitatory and inhibitory functions. Those are neurotransmitters. What neuromodulators are is chemicals that flood the brain, that drive the brain's plasticity. And I think all of you who use the Fast Forward products and Reading Assistant know that they've been specifically designed by our neuroscientists, Paula Talal, Michael Merznick, Bill Jenkins, Steve Miller, built into these products not only the tasks themselves that are designed to improve attentional skills, to improve working memory skills, to drive processing speed, to enable reading comprehension and language skills. But in addition to the content and the exercises, they're also designed to maximize neuromodulators associated with driving brain changes in very productive ways. And I just want to remind you of that and just go through the new research on the neuromodulators. So you all know that the neuromodulators that have been built into the Fast Forward products, into every exercise that's done, include acetylcholine, dopamine, norepinephrine. And to some extent, serotonin, which is a neuromodulator of well-being, is something that all of us work toward in our therapy sessions when we try to make our clients feel comfortable and safe. But the ones that specifically Mike Merznick and Bill Jenkins and Paula Talal targeted for the Fast Forward products are acetylcholine, dopamine, and norepinephrine. Now, just to remind you, acetylcholine is a neuromodulator associated with focused attention. So whenever a child or an adult has a task where they're really having to focus, and we want that attentional network that you saw, that major connectome that's so important for frontal lobe development, that is acetylcholine-based. And acetylcholine is what gets you to attend and enables you to attend to a task. Now, what's been built into the Fast Forward products is start buttons, so that a child or an adult using any of our products can never get a stimulus until they say it's time to turn it on. And that's also true of reading assistance. So the child is always in control of when the stimulus comes in, and that assures that you get just a little burst of acetylcholine to maintain and to drive this attentional mechanism. In addition, there are exercises built in to Fast Forward, like continuous performance exercises like Moon Ranch, that drive this sustained attention to a task so that the child has to stay focused. So when they hear ba, 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 da, that is called a continuous performance task, and one of the things that does is it drives sustained attention. Norepinephrine, you know, is associated with novelty, and you know that norepinephrine is upregulated through all of the game-like activities of the Fast Forward and Reading Assistant products, and all of the animations and all of the different characters. That creates the novelty that upregulates norepinephrine, which is also important for attention, and is also important for dopamine. Dopamine, you all know, is the save button of our brain's computer. It's what you have to have for any new connections to survive the night, if you will. And I just want to update you briefly on new research on each of these neuromodulators, just so you have it in case you want to explain this to your own clients or to the patients that you're working with or the parents. So this is research published in 2012 on acetylcholine as a neuromodulator, and the importance of acetylcholine that increases behaviors that are environmentally adaptive, meaning it enables us to tune ourselves to what we need to do within our environment and ignore things that are not relevant to the environment. And it decreases responses to stimuli that don't require immediate attention. In other words, it allows us to ignore distractions and focus on what's really important. This is the research they did. This is the slide of the effects of acetylcholine on cortical neurons and how activation enhances stimulation of very important cortical transmission from one part of the brain to the other. So this is just nice research. You can read and update yourself on acetylcholine if you're interested. The takeaway from their research is that acetylcholine is both excitatory and inhibitory. It allows you to ignore things that aren't relevant. It allows you to pay attention to what is relevant. That's really important for things like autism, where we probably have an imbalance of excitatory and inhibitory kinds of stimulation. It puts your client in charge, and that's what Fast Forward products are designed to do in Reading Assistant. Put your client in charge by letting them decide when they're ready for a stimulus. And whenever you, as a therapist, use movement and activity and establish eye contact with your clients, you are increasing acetylcholine levels. Now, the next article I want to share with you is on norepinephrine. This is an article by Sarah and Barrett, 2012, on the importance of norepinephrine regulating mood, motivation, and arousal. Again, norepinephrine is upregulated in all the Fast Forward exercises by the novelty that's built in. It's why they're expensive, part of why they're expensive. It's why they're engaging. It's why tasks as wonderful as Suzanne Jagge's NBAC task was in terms of a research tool, if you ever did it or tried to do it, you would find it's very boring and it's very hard to stick with it because it doesn't have this upregulation of norepinephrine, this novelty in game-like activities that keep you energized and motivated. This is the network. They show you the norepinephrine adapter chemical and how it's distributed in the brain. And they talk about how a surge of norepinephrine facilitates sensory and motor processing. So when you upregulate norepinephrine, you have heightened sensory skills and you have heightened responsiveness, and that's very important. You can utilize that as a clinician just by making all of your therapy sessions emotionally relevant, by tying it to your own client or child. Every time you bring in materials your child likes to do or the adult that you're working with, it makes it relevant to them. Suddenly what you're doing is you're upregulating norepinephrine. And we also know that novelty works well with dopamine too. But think of norepinephrine as the, wow, is that cool neuromodulator. And that's why so much energy and time has been built into the development of the Fast Forward products. It's one of the things that underlies them. Now finally, and this is the end of our talk, and then I'll take questions, we have the regulation of dopamine. Dopamine, you know, is a neuromodulator that is upregulated whenever you are rewarded. It's also upregulated when you're punished. It is probably the brain's way, evolution's way of making sure that things that have emotional value to you, that were either very positive in your life or very negative in your life, stick with you, so that you remember the terrible things that happened to you so that you can prevent them from happening again, and you remember the wonderful things that happened to you so that you can try to be goal-oriented toward obtaining those things. So the newer research on that was published by Trich and Sabatini. Again, all of this you can get from Google Scholar. You know the prefrontal cortex is the major recipient of dopaminergic impulses, so input. So when you upregulate dopamine, you drive the prefrontal lobe to mature, and that's what you're doing when you're working with your children. Every time you reinforce them, or every time they use something like Fast Forward and they become reinforced for getting something right, or they get the little ding for getting something wrong. Dopamine is believed to play a critical role in the prefrontal cortex networks for working memory, attention, and decision-making. And it's all about reward, reward, reward. Reward has to be meaningful, and it has to be frequent. And in the Fast Forward programs and in Reading Assistant, reward is very carefully timed so that the child is getting a reward within a very short period of time of getting a correct response, which maximizes, or is designed, I should say, to maximize the dopaminergic response in the brain. Be careful about rewards in your own clinical work where it isn't where you're rewarding an error, because you don't want to reward errors. That's one of the problems with some of the other video kinds of therapeutic tools out there, where rewards are not really carefully designed. So an animation may occur that's funny if a child makes a mistake, and the child actually finds that rewarding and so tries to make the mistake after that. Now, serotonin is the last neuromodulator that we want an update on, and this is the research on that. And it's also very important for modulating neuroplasticity of the networks. And the takeaway from that is that the environment in your clinic should be safe and non-threatening. The children should come in and be excited about it. It's so much fun to visit your clinics around the country and around the world, some of the VARS clinics, and see the way they prizes for all the kids. The kids walk in, and it's just such a welcoming, warm environment with wonderful things that the children can do. And when you design your clinic that way and making the clinic safe and non-threatening, and your therapy is supportive, what you are doing is actually making sure that serotonin is well modulated. So according to my clock, it is 11:15. I'm on time. And Carrie, you can take back control. I'm not exactly sure how you do that. Let's see if I have a way to do that.
Oh, I've got it, Dr. Burns. We're good to go. So now you should be looking, all of our attendees should be looking at the main WebEx screen. There is a chat window down at the middle right-hand side of your screen. Please submit questions there, and we'll address those. We're going to end the session right at 9:30 a.m. or sooner if we don't get any questions today. So please submit questions via your chat window. And again, if we don't get many questions, we'll end a little bit before 9:30. But if we get enough questions, we'll stay on the line until 9:30. If you have a question after the session today and we don't get to your question, please email us at webinars@scilearn.com. We have a few people saying thank you so much. What a huge amount of information now to process it all. So again, Dr. Burns, great presentation, and we're just waiting for questions to roll in now. Again, if no questions come in, we'll probably end a few minutes early. What we're going to do at 9:30 at Pacific time is start Paula Talal's session, and she will begin at 9:45 a.m. Pacific time. So here's a question, and this is definitely a good question. I'm glad you brought this up. One of our attendees is asking you to address the CogMed program for working memory. That is a program that I hear a lot about, both I know we hear about it here in the United States. I know that our international providers encounter CogMed around the world. So we would love to hear your thoughts on it, Dr. Burns.
Sure. So CogMed is another neuroscience program, and it is a working memory program primarily. So the CogMed program it was designed as a visual working memory program, and if you remember, I went through the slide on working memory very quickly. The Baddeley model, the Baddeley-Hitch model, proposes that phonological working memory is left frontal lobe and visual working memory is right frontal lobe, right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Auditory, verbal working memory would be left. And what they did when they developed CogMed, it was originally a company on its own, and it then was bought out, I'm pretty sure, by Pearson. So it's now a Pearson product. It was developed by psychologists, and it was only available for use by psychologists and physicians. When Pearson took it over, they've changed that now so that they have a hierarchy so other kinds of professionals can use it, like speech-language pathologists or occupational therapists. And it is usable by all of you if you want to include it in your clinical programs. And a lot of our VARs do actually include CogMed in addition to Word and Reading Assistant. The important thing I want you to get from CogMed, and there is some good research with CogMed. CogMed's original research was done by Klingberg, and he researched CogMed for use with ADHD. That was where most of their original research was done, with ADHD. And as you probably can figure out now from all of this research on connectomes, that when you exercise when you exercise working memory, you improve problem solving, you improve attentional skills. And so it would make sense that a visual working memory program would also improve attentional skills, which CogMed does. And CogMed does it through a different mode. It does it through visual working memory as opposed to Fast Forward that exercises auditory working memory. So for many of us as clinicians, we use lots of different products. We use lots of different interventions when we work with children. And the nice thing about CogMed is it works very well. It complements Fast Forward very well because it addresses working memory from an entirely different perspective, but a very complementary perspective. So if I have an adult with a traumatic head injury, for example, or I have a young child, an adolescent with ADHD, I might utilize Fast Forward to improve their auditory verbal working memory and attention, and I might use CogMed to improve their visual spatial working memory and visual spatial attentional skills. And as you remember from the connectomes, it looks like, especially Schachter's research, it looks like we may have different connectomes for auditory versus visually based attention, as well as auditory versus visually based working memory. So it is a good program. It has some nice research associated with it. I have no association with CogMed whatsoever, but I see it as complementary to the programs that we offer.
Great, thank you. Here's the next question from Lauren, one of our international providers from South Africa. Great to see you on here, Lauren. She is wondering if we have more info on specific fast-forward neuroscience research that might be underway. I do know we have a few new peer-reviewed articles, and Dr. Talal will be speaking next about some of the new research, but she's just wondering if there's any other neuroscience research.
So I have a blog that I'm going to be, that's going to be available, a blog post that's going to be available. I think I owe it to you, Carrie, I think the beginning of June, so I would think it'll be available as a blog post sometime around the middle to end of June on new research on the rhythms of the brain and auditory processing as it relates to these electrophysiological patterns in the brain. Very interesting research. Just a new article came out just for everybody who's interested in this on sleep. And if you tie auditory processing to different aspects of neuronal firing, when you sleep much better and more deeply. And that I was just reading that last night, which is why I'm bringing it up. But this research that was done by Heim et al. Is utilizing Fast Forward with children with auditory processing disorders, indicating that yes, you can have some dramatic effects on auditory processing, not just because you're exercising speech-sound discrimination, you're actually creating neurological firing patterns that are optimal for listening to and perceiving speech. So we have some excellent new research out there. Peer-reviewed research. I did go through the Stevens article that's been around a while, but I'm not sure how many of you are handing that out to your families. You should, on attention and the benefits of Fast Forward with attention. And then, as you said, Paula will be talking about research on college-level students using the Fast Forward products to improve writing skills and other more advanced kinds of skills. So there's a lot of good research out there now.
Great. And just to address someone's question, this is an easy one for us to answer. Someone asked if we had a value-added representative in Israel, and we do. We actually have pretty much worldwide, we have coverage outside of the U.S. and Canada. You can go to our SciLearn Global website at www.scilearnglobal.com, and that's actually our international website, and you can see a list of our international providers. So, Dr. Burns, next question. Can you distinguish between the definition of a neuromodulator versus a neurotransmitter?
Okay. It's kind of a technical distinction, but a neurotransmitter is a chemical that is released in the synapse. I mean, that's usually how it's considered. So it's called a transmitter because it's a chemical that is going to enable a synaptic connection to be transmitted from one neuron to the next. Neuromodulators, as the name implies, modulate overall brain function. So a modulator affects lots of the brain. And let's see how I could probably describe this to you in some kind of an analogy. Good nutrition is your body's modulator. So the way that you have energy during the day, the way that you can get things done, the way that you can really function well during the day is to eat well, consume lots of water, have lots of nutrition, and exercise, and all of that modulates your body. So that has an effect on your whole body. But if I wanted to just improve my ability to do one specific task, like play the piano, even though I'd want to be well-nourished and I'd want all of that, I would need to have exercises that worked on just that specific skill. So you can think of a neurotransmitter as a chemical that's responsible for very specific neurons firing or being at rest, whereas a neuromodulator is regulating the brain function overall.
Great. Next question is, has brain training been used to treat schizophrenia?
Mike Merznick was doing some research with various kinds of his programs, the Posit Science programs, as a way to treat early stages of schizophrenia. I think there are a couple of articles that have been published on that in Posit Science. I could look to find those if somebody's interested. That certainly is an interest of neuroscientists, but first they have to understand the underlying connectomes, and that's why you see research going to these connectomes in schizophrenia, because to understand how to drive changes in schizophrenia, it would be helpful if we could understand what parts of the brain need to be stimulated. But right now, there are neuroscientists, behavioral neuroscientists like Mike Merznick's team that have or at UCSF, that have looked at schizophrenia and specific kinds of exercises that are in the process of being studied. And I think, as I say, I think I recall 1 or 2 studies on that. My area of expertise is not schizophrenia, so that's why I'm a little vague about that. I'd have to go back and look at that research. But anyone could do a Google Scholar search. All you do is go to Google Scholar, type in schizophrenia, and I would probably type in, not brain training, but I would probably type in cognitive stimulation and see what you come up with.
Great. The next question is, and just so you're aware, we've got about another 3 or 4 minutes here until we conclude the presentation. If we don't get to your question today, please email it to webinars@scilearn.com, and we will give all the questions to Dr. Burns for her to answer. So the next question is, I love the way you related the chemicals in our brain to Fast Forward. Can we get a list of these relationships to present to our parents?
I think we probably could. I would have to check. Some of the information on that may be protected somehow. I just don't know. I mean, certainly the company has allowed me to talk about this for many years. I'm not sure to what extent it could be listed, but I will find out and we'll see. And we might be able just to summarize it briefly the way I summarize it in general terms. I think the important thing for you, though, and for clinicians, since most parents, this is going to be pretty much over their head, is just to explain that not only does Fast Forward have exercises designed to drive stimulating certain cognitive connectomes, if you want to use that, in the brain, but it's also been designed to maximize the neurochemistry of the brain for learning as well. And you've got this bibliography you could present of these authors on what dopamine does, what norepinephrine does, and you could provide that as kind of background information too. And then in the meanwhile, I'll find out what is proprietary, and by that I mean whenever you have anything that has patents, it's proprietary, and I don't know how much of that is protected and not protected, so we just have to kind of find that out.
Great. The next question comes in, and a couple of people had asked about, you mentioned a book by Chapman. Are there any other books which you think are friendly for laypersons, our clients or parents of our clients, to read that you think will help them understand this?
Okay. Chapman would be great and it's in your bibliography, if you're working with adults. That's what it's designed for. The best book if you have parents is The Brain That Changes Itself by Norman Doidge. I don't think there's a better book out there for parents than Norman Doidge's The Brain That Changes Itself. There's also one on auditory processing, I have trouble remembering it, that includes Fast Forward, something about listening underwater, something like that, but it's not as scientific. Norman Doidge's is an excellent book. It's very popular in Canada and Australia. Parents love it. Psychologists understand it. He is a physician, so it has a lot of credibility. And then another one that's a little harder to read, but is a very good book, is Stanislaus Dehaen's Reading in the Brain. And it also, both books cover Fast Forward and how they work and why they work.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Burns. And this is the end of our session today. We have to jump right on to the next one with Dr. Paula Talal. So again, if we did not get to your question, and I know we didn't get to several of the questions, please email them to webinars@scilearn.com. and hopefully we'll all see you on the next session. Again, I am going to conclude this session in about 60 seconds. I'm going to start up the next WebEx session and call back into the conference call. So as soon as I end this, it'll turn off both the WebEx and the conference call, but we will be right back. We'll start the next session, and Dr. Talal, I have heard, is with Hallie Smith in San Diego, so they are getting ready to present to you in 15 minutes at 9:45 Pacific time. So again, this will end the session right now. Any questions, please submit them to webinars@scilearn.com, and I want to thank Dr. Marty Burns for being our first presenter today. So thank you very much, Marty.
Thank you, Carrie. Bye-bye.
Okay, we'll see you on the next session. Bye, everybody.
Bye.